So, getting towards halfway through the year here with the month of June, quite a lot of big happenings. GB News launched in June to lay out a different view of news and current affairs. However, Freedom Day doesn't quite happen. The government delays easing restrictions by a month, and of course the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care is caught in an unfortunate situation. High point of the month, pubs reopen, still with limitations. Low point, well, obviously Freedom Day being kicked into the long grass, or at least a month away till freedom really returns in any meaningful form. Banter of the month, got to be Matt Hancock, right? Resigns after having been caught breaking his own social distancing rules. What else happened in June? Busy month. Junk food ban. The government brought forward a number of measures to curb obesity, including a ban on junk food advertising before the watershed and a ban on all online junk food adverts. The ban seems to include a wide range of foods which few would probably consider to be junk. Cheese, hummus, raisins, jam. Estimated impact of those measures was a small calorie reduction of about 17 calories per person. Zero COVID deaths for the first time in June, on the 1st of June. COVID deaths reported were naught. And we also had the G7 summit in June. So to pick through all of that in lightning fast time, I'm delighted to be joined by the Conservative Home Chief Exec, Mark Wallace. Mark, good to have you with us. And from the Home team, our very own Head of Regulatory Affairs, Victoria Hewson. Lovely to have you with us too, Victoria. Let's start with the unfortunate Matt Hancock. This was quite a grim moment, wasn't it, when all of this hit the papers? And amazingly, Mark, the government thought, the Prime Minister thought the case was closed, nothing to see here, move on regardless for about 24 hours.
Yeah, I mean, grim moment is one term for it. Bit of a jaws on the floor moment, I think, for an awful lot of people when you first saw that kind of front page and then went back to what the text was to find out who it actually was. Yeah, there was that, frankly, sadly, a pattern we've seen repeated since, which is this question of whether the government is going to be quick to realise the real reality of a situation, cut its losses and move on, or whether it's going to drag something out to what's an inevitable conclusion, but take an awful lot more pain, an awful lot more of a hit in the meantime. I
will defend you to my death for the first half of this news cycle. Seems often to be the position of 10 Downing Street, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And, Alistair Campbell always used to say, in his pomp when he was good at it before he went bonkers about Brexit, he always used to say that if something's going to happen in the end, you may as well be the person that makes it happen.
Yep.
And that was the way Blair's media management ran. It's evidently not the way Downing Street's been running in the last few months.
Victoria, what did you make of the Hancock scandal? I mean, clearly an egregious breach of the rules that he was imposing on the rest of us.
Well, it was, and the whole thing was terribly scandalous. He was cheating on his wife. The woman involved in the
That's
clinch,
not a scandal in today's world, is it?
Well, it should be. The woman involved in the clinch was a colleague, so there was all kinds of transgressions of HR codes of practice, not to mention that I think she was someone who he had specifically hired in to his team as well. And that's before we've even got to the social distancing rules, which is a rather tenuous breach, I suppose, because they were in the workplace. They were allowed to be in the workplace. I suppose technically they weren't carrying out essential business.
Depends on who you ask.
That would have been a last line of defence.
But I think it's got to be said that the end of Hancock probably was quite good in terms of the return of our freedoms. His successor, Sajid Javid, certainly has taken a more liberalising approach. So that was, I guess, potentially a positive outcome, because Hancock had become rather an authoritarian zealot about the rules and seemed unable to let go of the powers that he'd accrued.
So, Mark, let me move on to this other issue which I've flagged, the fighting the other pandemic, obesity. I find it ridiculous it's described as a pandemic. I've put on a stone over lockdown. I think you're unlikely to catch that from me, right? Seems to me a problem. But this is a government that has left the European Union, ostensibly on the grounds that we don't need all of these stupid goddamn rules from Brussels. And here we are with a ban on junk food. And and I think to most people's mind that would mean, I don't know, McDonald's can't claim that their hamburgers are healthy, for example. I mean, I would oppose even that, but it doesn't mean that. This is an extraordinary assault on the advertising industry and the food industry for a whole range of healthy foods, very tough regulations. Why is the government, and what do you at Conservative Home and your readers make of it, on the one hand giving the narrative of we need to deregulate, privatise, well maybe not privatise, but have free enterprise at the centre of it, encourage businesses. But if you're a hummus producer, there's no way you can run an advertising campaign on Facebook. The policies seem in no way to match the narrative.
Well, it was personally very troubling. As you well know, Mark, all I eat is hummus, cheese, jam and raisins in various different, increasingly elaborate combinations. So it felt like a personal assault. But you're absolutely right. Obviously, the narrative about take back control, sadly, doesn't preclude, of course, the creation of our own bad, silly laws just with the Union flag stuck on them rather than blue with the yellow stars. I think it's also a major problem for Boris Johnson personally, because what did people think of him as being? Well, they thought of him not as a misery guts Prime Minister, they thought of him as somebody who understood and endorsed some kind of capacity for human joy, should we say, particularly after the last, the preceding year and a bit, all the lockdowns, the stuff that the government openly said it was doing reluctantly and was being kind of forced on it, people largely understood, to then say, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to go out of our way to try and cut off new businesses that might start up, the little things you might enjoy in life, and then to have the man in the ministry telling you what you can consume doesn't sit well with people. It particularly doesn't sit well with an awful lot of Conservative Party members for obvious reasons.
Victoria, what's your take on this? Where's this all coming from? Because it doesn't seem to fit the grain of the Boris Johnson narrative. It doesn't obviously seem to be popular. I mean, it doesn't seem to me to be wise. Why is this stuff coming out against the narrative of the government, against, as Mark says, the sort of personality we'd usually associate the Prime Minister with? It's not obvious to me that banning adverts for hummus is the smartest way to retain the red wall, right?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer, because you see it, across the regulatory and policy making space in government at present. Boris Johnson, I think, didn't he come in with some dismissive comments about a milkshake tax? He was pretty anti-nanny state on all of this. I don't know, is it just a case that the public health blob is so entrenched that it's very hard for ministers to push back on it? And perhaps they just don't particularly want to because they think there are bigger battles for them to fight. But I think this is actually quite a big battle, because it's not just about small businesses and competition and consumer choice, it's also a free speech issue. And June was actually Free Speech Month at the IEA, because we also published our book about all of the various threats to free speech. I wrote a chapter about threats in the online space. The online safety bills now being published, and we also had a chapter in that book about advertising, because advertising is a manifestation, or should be a manifestation, of free speech.
And we'll make sure that book, you can click on the link to that in the show notes below if you want to read our free speech book. We tried to make it Free Speech Month. It was here at the IEA, sadly not in most of the rest of the country. I want to move very quickly on to the G7 summit in Cornwall. This also happened in the month of June. Fears about new COVID variants didn't seem to worry the world leaders too much then. But I think the main point of the G7 conference coming out of that was this commitment to a minimum global corporation tax, Mark. Now, again, I was just saying about Brexit, I thought the idea of it was that we could get rid of quite a load of rules. I didn't realise the point of leaving the European Union was that so President Joe Biden could set our tax rates for us. Again, I found this a bit confusing. Help me through it.
Well, I think you're not the only person that found it confusing. I think an awful lot of people, particularly the fact that, if the government was into this, if that's what they really wanted to do, was to take these powers and then use them in bad ways or alienate them in other forums. If that was going to be their message, they didn't tell anyone beforehand. They didn't roll the pitch. They didn't prep their own backbenchers or kind of explain what part this played in their grand economic theory. They just kind of blundered into this, or it felt like they blundered into this agreement, which has really wide-ranging consequences, particularly for those, largely you'd hope on the Tory benches, who are meant to believe in not just low tax, but tax competition.
Yeah,
we should be competing with our former EU neighbours. I've got to say, if you're going into that G7 thinking, what's the big issue really looming in the next few months, and you decide the big issue was business being too successful, expanding around the world, and didn't think, well, in a few months' time we could all be talking about how Russia might want to further invade Ukraine, for example, then I think you kind of missed the boat on the actual topic.
Not on the ball. Victoria, what did you make of this? If this happened in the private sector of major companies getting together rather than major countries and fixing prices, it would be called out as a cartel.
Well, for sure, our hyperactive competition regulators seem keen enough to crack down on cartels and anti-competitive behaviour. And yet this seems like a terrible example of a cartel, sort of like OPEC. In the oil industry. I do think the other interesting thing about the G7 was also what wasn't discussed at that summit, where Joe Biden didn't discuss that he was about to pull out of Afghanistan, and Britain and America didn't break it to the French that we were about to do them over on the submarine deal with the AUKUS arrangement. So the usefulness of that summit, apart from of course that they all got to show off their COVID credentials by going through that ridiculous pantomime of elbow bumping and social distancing on the podium, only to be found mingling blissfully at the cocktail party afterwards. So not a great look.
So a bit of a month of hypocrisy, June. Now I want to finish by asking each of you, thanks for talking us through June, but I want each of you to give us your rating out of 10 for the year as a whole. It needs to be an integer. Just give me one number. Don't say, well, I was 6, 7 or 8 or 4.32. And Mark, let me begin with you. So 0 is nothing could have gone worse, absolute catastrophe. 10 would be nothing could have possibly gone better over the year. How do you audit 2021 as a whole?
I'm desperately trying to remember what score I gave last year. But
that was also, usually I'm asking how optimistic people are thinking.
Oh,
this could be a bit of a retrospective now, so there's no excuse for being wrong.
There's no guess. There's never an excuse. There's never need to excuse being wrong if you're in my modest shoes. I'm going to go for a 7. I think this year's come in, frankly, despite various downsides, it's come through a bit better than it threatened at the start.
Okay, a 7, pretty upbeat. Victoria?
Yeah, no, nowhere near. I'm going to go for a 3.
3?
Yeah, I can't really think of any positives on the public policy side, apart, I suppose, from Lord Frost and his team holding the line quite well in the post-Brexit negotiations. I had a really nice summer holiday in Greece. That was good.
That's 2 of the 3 points. Yeah.
And the third point, I suppose at least the pubs eventually did reopen. So, yeah, that's my slightly downbeat assessment.
Okay, well, on that downbeat note, let's have a bit of Christmas cheer. Share a cracker with me, Mark.
Let me grip this grim death.
There you go. Yeah. You can't. So let's see what the extremely witty IEA economics joke is in this particular cracker. It is. This is quite new. Why does Jeremy Corbyn only write in lowercase?
Because he's opposed to capitalism.
Yes, because he is opposed to capitalism.
It was that
Very
or because
good.
he's functionally illiterate.
I can see you working out which answer you were going to give. Mark, Victoria, thanks very much for joining us. Have an extremely Merry Christmas, and here's to a much brighter 2022. Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.